The idea of a glass girl is both the sense of something that's very beautiful, like a glass figurine, very composed, but it fractures easily. For them to be in this way, like made of glass, it's something that has a lot of beauty in its fragility, but a lot of strength in and being breakable and still finding a way to stay whole.
This is Storied Account with Jen Jumba. I'm in conversation with writers, and I think when you're in conversation with writers, something magical happens. And as readers, we begin to see them as human beings and not just the name on the spine of a book. My hope is through these conversations, when you learn about their craft and them as a person, you'll become fiercely loyal and want to read their current book, entire backlist, any future book, any book they blurb. And when you see their name, you'll want to support them, not only as incredible storytellers, but also the thoughtful individuals you have come to know. Today's guest is a debut writer, Danie Shokoohi. Her debut novel, Glass Girls, is an exceptional ghost story published by Zando, or Gillian Flynn, and I cannot wait to talk to her about it. Danie is a Paris-based writer and a 2020 graduate of UW-Madison MFA. Her work has been published or is forthcoming in the Puritan, Glass, a Journal of Poetry, the American Journal of Poetry, New Ohio Review, Lake Effect, the Mississippi Review, the Cincinnati Review, and many others. Danie is the managing editor at Half Mystic Press, which makes her fall in love with writing again every day. She's a devoted listener of pod dramas, an avid tarot reader, and the queen of making too many playlists. And I was lucky enough to meet Danie earlier this year when I moderated a panel of debut writers. And I can say I shouldn't say haunted. I was struck by this book. But this story she tells will be with you long after you turn the last page. So I'm so excited to welcome Danie.
Hello, everyone.
So let's talk a little bit about Glass Girls, right? An incredible story. And you open it up with a snippet from a researcher. Her name is Bessel van der Kolk. And there's a phrase about without a functioning Broca's area, you cannot put your thoughts and feelings into words. And it talks a little bit about the impact that trauma has on the brain. That there have actually been studies where there are lesions that form on the brain, just as if you had had a stroke. Can you talk a little bit about why that was one of the opening pages of the book and how it sets the tone moving forward?
Absolutely. So trauma and the theory around how trauma lives in the body is something I was thinking a lot about while I was writing Glass Girls, because Glass Girls actually originated out of my journey of being diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the same time that I was thinking about what it would mean to have a family and talking about my own sort of inherited traumas and therapy. And so I was doing a lot of reading about that because I'm someone who wants to understand I intellectualize a lot. And I feel like if I understand what's happening in my brain, it somehow makes it easier to process.
Agreed.
Yeah. And so when I was doing that research and I was reading The Body Keeps the Score, which is the main book by Bessel van der Kolk, it was really fascinating to me to learn about the ways that trauma lives in the body and how one of the things that can be really difficult about experiencing a traumatic event is that it often feels so isolating because it becomes very difficult to touch it because it's very hard to verbalize it. And so that can add to this sort of sense of loneliness around the experience. So the reason that ended up becoming one of the epigraphs of Scrolls is because what happens to Alice is so traumatic that it fundamentally changes her identity, makes her rename herself. But also because the past timeline in this book, it's not so much flashback as it is what Alice is refusing to address even by herself.
It's an incredible story. So let's talk a little bit about Alice and her sister. You know, they grew up together. Their mom read them bedtime stories. Not sure that as a kid I got those same bedtime stories. I think I had a much happier version, but they talk about night was when their mother was the most dangerous and the most capable of hurting them. And she told them a story about a girl who cut off her shadow. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I started Glass Girl. I knew that I had to start it with a fairy tale,
Mm-hmm.
partially out of my own sense of cheekiness of like, okay, yeah, here's my first novel, like, hee hee, once upon
Yeah.
a time.
Yeah.
But also because I think the stories that we grew up with really end up shaping our sense of identity, and we relate to them in different ways. So the story about the girl who cut her shadow off, their mother intends to be a cautionary tale. So essentially the story is this woman finds herself pregnant. She's a witch like they are, and her lover doesn't really accept the witchy parts of her. So she goes to the woods and gets, this old oak tree to tell her how to cut off her shadow, which is where her magic lives.
Tree didn't want to tell her initially, refused several times.
No time.
Several
And
times.
she threatens him with fire. And
As
then,
a tree,
yeah,
yeah, pretty bad.
yeah, but feel like that one might be one of the top three worst fears for trees. So eventually she bullies this tree into telling her how to get rid of her magic, and that's to cut her shadow. And she does so, but then afterward, the lover still won't marry her because even though he was scared of her power, he doesn't like what's left when she takes it away. And their mother intends this to be like, don't ever make yourself like normal people are pathetic and ordinary, and you should never break yourself down
Yes.
for them. But what's interesting is later in the book, Alice does exactly that. She cuts off her shadow, she cuts off her magic out of desperation. And you find her mother is the main reason why.
Yes. So you brought up the fact that they're witches, right? And that they have powers and they have gifts. And to your point, her mother says that we must never question our gifts, never for anyone. I think those of us in current day probably question ourselves a lot when we are bestowed with a gift of sorts or a superpower skill. I think there's a whole imposter syndrome for a reason, right? But
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about Alice, or when she was growing up. Her name was Bo, and her sister Bronwyn. Talk a little bit about their powers and why you chose to give them those powers or gifts.
Alice came to me as a spirit medium, like pretty much immediately. And the rest of the book actually came from this idea of Alice as someone who speaks to the dead. And it's funny because I was in the middle of researching what I thought was going to be my first novel, and it was about like Salem, Massachusetts, and like ghosts. And I was doing a lot of research at the time to try to build out this world. And I stumbled on this book about the Duke Parapsychology Clinic University. I'm not sure where, center, one of those. But there was an anecdote about a woman who'd been a child medium. And then when she turned 18, she decided completely leave that world, leave it completely behind, and refused to speak to the dead for the rest of her life. And that sort of made me wonder, like, what, if you grow up in the world, if you grow up steeped in this kind of environment of you have this gift, you have this thing that makes people think you are special and interesting, what could possibly happen to make you walk away from that? And so that's where the plot of the book sort of developed. But Bronwyn's gift, I think Bronwyn is a diviner. So she's someone who's able to find people or objects by locking onto their energies. And I picked that gift for her because she's someone who is very, like, she has a strong compass, I think. Like Bronwyn is someone who's like very decisive when she decides something, like it's gonna happen, come hell or high water. So they're very different that way. Like Alice is very full of like insecurity and worry and anxiety, and Bronwyn's just very decisive.
Absolutely. I would think as a medium, and I'm joined in conversation with Danie Shokoohi, who wrote Glass Girls, her debut novel, so there's more coming. But when we think about being a medium, I would think it would have to be incredibly distracting. If you can see people who have passed on and they're wanting to communicate with you to resolve something, I mean, how you're able to just shut that part of you off, to me, I think that would be a challenge, especially because in the book, they appear to be real. I mean, they're not like ghost-like figures or like shadows so that's the thing. Like, how do you differentiate? Like, yeah, that's real and that's not. I find that just an incredible part of the story.
It's almost like intrusive thoughts, right? Like, and especially when you aren't sure if the person you're addressing like is a person or a ghost. And the only way that you can tell is they like smell a little bit like ozone, you
Yeah,
know?
and so that was the other thing too. I didn't know ozone had a smell, and you talk about that in the book too. I mean, I know that there's a big gap above our heads, right, of terms of ozone and, things, but the distinctive smell, and then I think their eyes were a little bit different if they had passed on.
If they were a poltergeist,
Okay.
yeah. If they're a poltergeist, their eyes are black, no irises,
Okay,
no
so let's talk a
sclera.
little. Can we talk a little bit about that, about the difference between a ghost and a poltergeist? I mean, I
Yes.
kind of think I know, like one's good, one's bad, but how one becomes a poltergeist versus a ghost.
In the world of Glass Roll, this was something I struggled over for years because I knew, the way that I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, not every haunting is necessarily bad. Like we have positive memories with people that
Yes.
we love to have passed away. We have positive nostalgia, right?
Hmm.
But also it can be there are very negative and disruptive hauntings that we have of our past. And I wanted that to come through in the ghosts in the book. The figuring out the world building was hard because the poltergeists had to be rare. There had to be something different about them for them to be able
So
to
glad they're rare.
possess.
So glad they're rare. Just
Yeah,
saying.
me too. Me too. But so in the world of Glass Girls, poltergeists are made. The ghosts happen, poltergeists are ritually and magically made, which ties them to another person and leaves the poltergeist able to possess a medium, which ghosts cannot do longer.
Yeah, that I learned too through reading this book, and the world. I was completely immersed in it and just completely fascinated by all the different things that I learned. So I want to say thank you for that. And I know we were talking a little bit earlier about books and how great books are because you're able to see inside that character's mind and you're able to see inside their thought process, which, there's the, who did what, but then there's the why they did that, which I think is part of what draws at least me as a reader to a book. So just thinking about Alice, I mean, the story opens and Alice, also known as Bo, when she, decides she's done with that life and she decides to cut out her shadow and live a seemingly normal medium free life, we'll say. So, it's kind of amazing. I mean, it opens with that and you think, okay, all things are going great. She has this great guy. They live in this fantastic house that he built. Typical drama with like, a semi mother-in-law coming to visit and the stress and the drama that creates. And you're like, okay, totally and completely relatable. Until she goes to the grocery store to pick up some things because her partner's mother wants a certain dish prepared. So can you talk a little bit about that scene in the grocery store?
It's one of the first scenes that I actually wrote in the
Really?
whole book. Yeah, because I had this very vivid image of, that domestic anxiety that when you're so sucked into your mundane life, that those small things can be so high pressure. Like, okay, my mother-in-law is going to judge me if I use a certain brand of cranberries. So which
Yeah.
brand do I
Organic,
use?
not organic. I was like, oh
Yeah,
my, like stressing with her in the grocery store.
right. And you're just sitting there and you're like, okay, what are all the little tiny ways that this woman is going to criticize me? And, I have to be perfect. I have to be perfect. And then the past kind of slams into you. So I had this image of her like fully wrapped up, juggling these cranberry cans. And then there's a woman watching her from the foot of the app. And initially she makes the choice not to recognize. She, is she feels like she's safe. It's been 16 years since she left the family. She hasn't seen hint or hair of them since. And she feels like she's safe, but it slams into her in the middle of this domestic crisis, which is very in character with Bronwyn. She's kind of a freight train.
She is. I mean, you spoke to her earlier. She's very decisive. When she makes her mind up to do something, she does it and she follows through. A lot of times I think we as humans make up our mind and then it's the follow through that's always a little bit challenging. So like there are times where, after having read this earlier and reading it again, like I need to channel my inner Bronwyn, like just go, just do it, and see what happens. But
I do the same.
Yeah. Okay, good. We're kindred spirits then. So Alice talks a little bit about having, separated herself from how she grew up. And she talks about hope. And she says, hope is a terrible and intoxicating medicine. And I think that's so true. You talk about, a little bit about that line and that phrase.
Yeah. So when I wrote that line, I was thinking a lot. Hope is one of those things that gives us light in our darkest days, but also can be a little bit bitter when we're still in the depths of that darkness. That when hope is like, it's persistent, it's hard to like press it down or press it away. But when the thing that you are hoping for fails to manifest, it's also very painful and very heavy and hard to sit with. And in this book, where so much of the characters' lives have been steeped kind of in this kind of violence, in this kind of grinding away at pieces of themselves, hope is what keeps them going. And hope is also what makes it so much harder to live through the worst of it.
Absolutely. It makes me think about how many times I've said to somebody, well, like, I hope it gets better. And I'm like, there's me using that hope word, which on one hand you want to hang on to. And on the other hand, there's no substitute for time, so you still have to go through that, dark phase, kind of holding on to hope. And I think it's so interesting. So can we talk about why Bronwyn, after all these years came back to find her sister?
Yes. I don't want to give too
No.
much
No. No spoiler.
No spoilers. So I think on a very practical level, she needed Alice's skill set. She needed Alice's knowledge. Because Bronwyn and Alice were treated very differently by their mother, Giselle, in terms of their magical education. Bronwyn gets a little neglected growing up.
A little?
I mean, understatement of the year.
I was going to say, she gets a lot neglected.
She gets a lot neglected. She kind of gets the worst of it. Alice has a lot of this really rich background and this sort of research that her and her mother do together about her gift, and gets a lot of attention about her magic. So on a very practical level, Bronwyn just needs someone who knows. And they grew up so isolated from other witches or the possibility of other magical people that Alice is really her only resource for what she needs to accomplish. But I think also there is a part of her that something bad has happened and she just needs her sister.
Yeah, I think it speaks to just families in general. We grow up the way we do. I think parents, by and large, are doing the best they can. I have spectacular parents, but I realize I'm very lucky that not everybody has that. But yet there's still this tug to family to show up when needed. And so I was struck by that they could find each other, and just some of the stuff, the antics in the car ride, the nudging of stuff, and I can't believe you're, smoking that, and I can't believe you're drinking that. And, I'm not listening to that music. I mean, it's typical sibling banter, that kind of goes back and forth, which was wonderful that you captured, in the book.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the fact that they're going back to Kirkland, Ohio, which is not far from where I am, being here in Cleveland, I just thought, oh, that's really kind of neat to be able to see that. And yet you talk about them growing up isolated. I mean, I would think that there would be like, is it called a coven of witches? Like,
Yes.
a community, and to not have that and that sense of duality, that I'm, going to school, and at the same time, I'm also a witch with medium, a medium skill set, um, has to be, unique. And thinking you separated yourself from it, but I don't know that we can ever really separate where we come from.
I would absolutely agree that it's very hard to pull pieces of yourself apart outside of the whole of yourself. Um, and in a way, like that split is what attracted me so much to the Glass family in general.
Mm-hmm.
That they're not just one thing. Like things are very pulled apart and fragmented in their sense of identities. Which for me, growing up in an Iranian family post 9/11, I was second grade when that happened. And I was going home and speaking Farsi and going, to school and speaking English. In the Midwest, things were a little hostile towards Middle Eastern people when I was growing up.
Yeah.
So I had to do a lot of code switching, in short. I'm very adept at it. I mean, it's a third language for me. And so writing Glass Girls and having, Alice and Bronwyn sort of be one thing at home and another thing with other people felt like a much more natural way for me to put that experience into.
Yeah, because you could feel that sense of tension that existed, between them just trying to figure out, I want to say, where they belong, so to speak. So, is there a reason why you chose the word glass for their family name? Because I think about like how things are so fragile that we hold so dear, and how one simple thing can, or am I overthinking? Because I've been accused of that too.
Not at all. I'm a huge symbolism nerd. So if there's something weird you're seeing in the book, I probably did it on purpose. So for their surname, later in the book, you do find out that Giselle's name is probably not their actual name, and that it's one that Giselle chose for the family. And to me, having the act of like claiming your name as a choice
Mm-hmm.
is something I find really interesting. That sense of, different facets of yourself in different places. How a family nickname changes which version of yourself you are with which people. And so for me, picking glass was, and the idea of a glass girl is both the sense of something that's very beautiful, like a glass figurine, very
Mm-hmm.
delicate,
Right.
very composed, but also very fragile and very breakable, fractures easily. So for them to be in this way, like made of glass, it's something that has a lot of beauty in its fragility, but also a lot of strength in and being breakable and still finding a way to stay whole.
I mean, again, like the duality that you're able to capture, I think is just so special. And then I also think about glass and what it reflects, back to the community and back to the people that she's, with, her family and her partner, husband. So yeah,
Serious boyfriend. Yeah.
serious boyfriend. Yeah.
I actually recently had the opportunity earlier this month to go to Venice, which is really well known for Murano glass.
Absolutely.
And I actually got to tour a glassmaking factory and see the way that they heat and temper glass to be the kind of beautiful thing that we see as the finished product. It wasn't something I was actively thinking about when I picked glass for them as their last name. There is something in the sense of like glass is forged under some really wildly difficult conditions.
Right. And then it has to anneal, because if it cools too fast, then it shatters,
Then it,
right? So
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, I do lamp working. So understand the process of the really high heat and then it having to cool otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah.
Flawed. So to me, that's fascinating. And the fact that you got to see that firsthand is incredible.
I would highly recommend. It was a very cool experience.
Awesome. So I'm joined in conversation today with Danie Shokoohi, who's the debut writer of Glass Girls. Speaking of surnames, I find this kind of interesting. So Bo changes her name to Alice, last name Hazarat, named after what I see in Lakeview Cemetery, the Hazarat Angel. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Hazarat Angel in Lakeview?
Absolutely. So the Hazarat Angel is a statue. I think she's technically considered a black angel, right? Which is a type of statue that you see a lot in cemeteries of these angel figures that have either sort of darkened with age or have tear marks from the oxidization. And I've always been really fascinated with those figures because I did my undergraduate at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, and there is also a black angel in the Iowa City cemetery. That when I was 18 and in the writers living learning community, we like dared each other to go touch it at midnight. It was like this whole
Yeah,
as you do when you are 18.
absolutely.
And so it was a little bit of a later addition to the first draft that her last name was Hazarat and that the angel was there. So I actually, for the first 5-ish years of my life, lived in Kirtland. My family lived there before we moved to Saginaw, Michigan. And I'm still very close with my childhood best friend from age 6.
Aw.
Her name is Autumn. She lives in Mentor and Willowick. And so when I was writing Glass Girls and I knew that it was going to take place in Kirtland, I asked her if, I could come and meet up with her. And she put together this whole insane itinerary of like visiting Coventry and Kirtland again and Willoughby, and all these places
Yeah.
for me to see. And one of the things that we did was go through Lakeview Cemetery and go see the Hazarat Angel. And it was like one of the like fundamental memories that I have of this visit is us very slowly driving around this very foggy cemetery, playing Panic at the Disco and like
Yeah.
talking about witchcraft.
Yeah, I was going to say Queen of Playlists. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So when I was thinking about, I really wanted the Hazarat Angel to
Oh,
be
it
like a
fits
big thing in the
perfectly.
book.
Yeah, it fits
Yeah,
perfectly in this book. And also makes me think, right? So Bronwyn, has the ability to locate people or objects. And some days I really wish she were around because, older I get, the more things I seem to misplace. But what I'm thinking about is the fact that Alice changed her name. Her surname is now Hazarat, but there's a connection because as kids, they used to have like quote unquote family meetings at that Hazarat Angel. So it makes me think, does Alice subconsciously want to be found if that name is something that has a connection to her childhood? Even though she's trying to
yeah,
distance herself from it, you put the name out there so that maybe someday when fate has it.
yeah. That as Bronwyn says, you couldn't have been more obvious if you had tried. Yes, they do have these like sibling council meetings in front of the Hazarat Angel. I think Alice names herself after the angel as a way of honoring Killian because he's the one that's really obsessed with this angel, their little brother. And the other name that the Hazarat Angel has is the formal name is the Angel of Death Victorious, which there's a certain cheekiness to that I think Alice like okay, I'm not a medium anymore. So I am the Angel of Death Victorious. It's in the past. No more death for me.
Exactly.
Which, of course, is not true.
No, of course not.
No.
Can we, can we talk a little bit about their brother? Killian, which
Yes.
is like an integral part of the story, kind of why there's tension that exists, in her current life, as well as what happened when she grew up.
Yeah, Killian is probably the hardest character I've ever written, to be honest.
Really?
Oh yeah. I have a lot of trouble writing children, which half the book is written from Alice's perspective when she's a child. So you can imagine how fun that part of the writing process was for me.
Well, I was going to say it plays well and it reads well. So I'm sorry that it's tough for you, but I'm also grateful that you pushed through the toughness because it was great to hear her perspective as a kid and to see
Thank you.
her, revisiting the stuff that happened. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think there's a challenge about writing children in the sense that it's very worth it, but it's also very difficult to strike the balance between what's believably childish without it being like kitsch on the page.
yeah,
And Killian, too, knowing what happens to him was especially a challenge because I really wanted to strike the balance between this being a character that you like, but also he's kind of one of the main antagonists of the book.
yes,
He's so fundamental into how Alice interacts with the world around her as an adult and as a teenager and as a child. And her feelings of protectiveness and love for her brother really do alter her fundamentally. But also there's a lot of pain there. So he has to be this sort of developed character into himself. So the way that I did that was have him lean a little bit more like on the alt side. He's like a very alt.
yeah. I think what I was struck by the character Killian is, we talked a little bit earlier about, things being black and white and really, they're a lot more nuanced. But I thought he as a kid, I think saw more of the black and the white side of things, right? And I think that's what most kids do until they've had more life experience and can understand, well, not everything is all good, not everything is all bad. So that was the thing I was struck by with him, is being able to see all the good, and he had as much hope as any character in that book that you captured, and then things become, all bad. So that, I think, you did a great job in terms of that character development to reflect that he was a kid.
Thank you.
Well, you're quite
Thank you.
welcome. So, talking a little bit about, and I'm joined in conversation with Danie Shokoohi, debut writer, Glass Girls, multiple points of view, different timelines, how you as a writer choose to use that structure to tell the story, and how, you essentially, how that impacts how you choose to tell the story in terms of structure.
So I knew very early on that the book was going to be about and inherited trauma. And for me, structure is always a reflection of what the story is about. So I originally was trying to, when I was first writing Glass Girls, do something a little bit more traditional with like classic flashbacks. So, present timeline is Alice, past timeline is Bo, and alternate. And that really was not working. And in time, I came to realize that when you have a character who does not, under any circumstances, want to look at their past or think about it or acknowledge that it's even happened. And if you're working in a third person limited present tense framework, that character is not going to let you move into a flashback. They're not going to go into it. They're not going to touch it.
Right. They're
So what
honoring what their
you
character's about, right?
exactly like you can't force the character to do a thing that's out of character, or you can, but it's not good writing. So what do you do then if you have to tell the reader the story of what happened and that character is not going to let you do it? Well, you write the things that slip through. So for the past timeline, what I ended up doing was using a narrative nonfiction called Double Perspective. And so the idea behind this is the person who is writing a nonfiction essay or a narrative about their past is never the version of themselves that lived the event. There's always a layer of distance. You're always a slightly different person than the event that you are talking about. And the you in the present who's writing it knows more than the you that lived. And so I thought, how cool would this be to apply to a trauma narrative? Because,
Yeah.
you know, Alice is Alice and not Bo. So Alice knows things that Bo didn't. And Alice is the one that's technically experiencing these things that slip through. It's not Bo.
Right.
So the structure was really a choice that came out of honoring the experience of living with trauma in your body. Because the you that is reviewing the memories of what you lived through always knows more than the you.
That that is so well said, and that's going to stay with me for a long time because I think about that, and that makes sense because if you've survived it and gone through it, obviously you have that healthy distance in the, current tools that you're using to have acknowledged that it happened and essentially move forward. That is really interesting to me to hear it phrased like that. And speaking of trauma, there's lines in the book. I'm a reader when they talk about reading for character or setting or language or story. And I think this has all of it. There are certain phrases that I just write down and then I want to pull them out and reread them, from time to time. But there's a thing in there that talks about that's the way of trauma. It eats the good that came before it. It's a line that I just had goosebumps when I read and just how impactful that is. So yeah, this is just such an incredible story to explore trauma. And I think the other things that books give us is that healthy distance to talk about a character experiencing something. So you're not talking to the person directly across the table when you're discussing a book. You're talking about a character, so you can kind of gives you permission maybe to talk about tough stuff, or it's a lead in to talk about tough stuff because it's starting with a character, which is that, I don't say healthy distance.
Absolutely. I think too, I'm someone who finds it very hard. I'm like very open about my past, but also I find it very difficult to write about myself or to create narrative about myself and my story. Like there's somehow just this block that happens for me. And I don't think narrative nonfiction is my medium. I do find that when I'm, you know, obviously my characters are they're pieces of you, they're pieces of real life. They are not me, my story, or my family, or
Right.
I borrow, I don't steal.
Yeah,
I
there you
borrow
go.
pieces, I don't steal. Yeah. But I do find it's a lot easier to explore themes in fiction than it is to sort of address them head on. Because when you're fictionalizing something, it allows you to sort of look at all angles of the thing without touching it.
Yes.
And so one example of this for me is in the story, Alice, you find out in the first chapter, is pregnant. It is not a wanted pregnancy. And she is struggling the entire time because in her family, all of the girls get gifts and all of the boys die before they turn 19.
Mm-hmm.
And, and like I said earlier, I was writing this while I was getting my bipolar diagnosis, and bipolar is a condition that is strongly genetic. And it's very strong genetic tie. And I was thinking about what it would mean for me to have kids with the risk of passing on that disorder.
Right.
And where at the end of Alice makes the choice that is best for her. I landed on a different side. I'm someone like I decided I do want to have kids because of writing Alice, who was very on the fence about it. And in that way, it's sort of, because I was thinking so much about what it means and like what you inherit and what the choice passed on means. Like I landed on a different side for myself, but I
Right.
wouldn't have gotten there if I wasn't writing about Alice's worries about mother.
Absolutely. That multiple perspective so that you have not this siloed viewpoint of something, I think is really helpful. I wish we would all do that when we're making decisions, because I think it's really helpful. And I am still struck by the trauma in this book, in particular, Frank. So Giselle marries Frank, kind of creates a location spell to find this great, wonderful guy. So becomes a stepfather to Beau, Alice, and Bronwyn. And the things that as a stepfather, there were times where, you know, he wasn't the greatest, and at the same time, he was the greatest. And so it's the same person, but that inconsistent way of treating both Bronwyn and Alice becomes a challenge to try to process, you know, as a young kid. And then that carries with you to adulthood. So, I mean, there was a line, and I'm not sure I have it with me, about Frank is a stepfather who loved Alice and didn't love her enough.
Yes. There is a Frank who loved Alice, and there is a Frank who did not.
Yeah. And I think there probably are people in our lives that feel like that. Like, I think there's probably, everybody has a Frank somewhere along the line. So I think, you know, yes, the book, you know, is this wonderful, haunting, you know, ghost story and witches, and at the same time, incredibly relatable, because you're capturing emotions that we've all experienced as humans. And I think, you know, sometimes we read to escape. No, sometimes we read to feel not alone. And so I think that's a wonderful gift that you all as writers give us as readers. So yeah, so thank you.
You are very welcome. And I think you're touching on something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of what writing is supposed to do and why writers write. Because I think you're right. There's sometimes that we read for entertainment. There's sometimes that we read for escape. But sometimes we read to see the things in the mirror that we don't know how to say, that we don't know how to verbalize.
Goes back to Broca's area of the brain.
Yeah.
Before I was a librarian, you know, my life changed. I was in radio sales. So I sold air, and I wrote a lot of commercials, and we used to always talk about Broca's area because we would say something and we would want people, it's what radio does because it's audio, is to be able to connect with something in somebody's brain that you don't quite have the language for, but people can picture. And so seeing it kind of come full circle and you talk about it and explore it in this book, you know, makes me think about, you know, trauma in a different way. You know, and never knowing what people are battling. You know, there's studies that talk about people who read tend to be more empathetic, and hopefully that carries through. Hopefully they're like the Bronwyn empathetics, you know, where
Yeah.
I need to be kinder. I'm going to make up my mind and I'm going to be kinder. Even somebody who says something so ridiculous, still going to be kind because they're fighting something I just don't possibly know.
Exactly. Yeah.
So did you know, I'm just going to ask a question. Did you know the ending of the book before you wrote it?
It's changed a little bit. Glass Girls actually originated as a short story, and it was quite funny. I wrote it as a short story. It was like 20 pages, and I took it to a workshop. And after class, my professor pulled me aside and was like, "This is your novel." I was like, "Oh, no, 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 no! Like I'm working on something else. Yeah, it takes place in Salem." And I started to tell her, and she cut me off, and she was like, "This is your novel."
Yeah. Well, thank
Which
her.
is
Yeah.
no,
It's just,
absolutely,
it's an incredible story. Characters that are
absolutely.
relatable and yet different, and understanding why they did what they did. Yeah, I just completely enjoyed it. Everybody listening is going to go out and read it, and they'll enjoy it as well. So as we wrap up, which is always the hard part, because I could talk to you the rest of the day, even though there's a big time difference right now. So we get to story's end, right? Final 5 questions. Killian is partial to watching How I Met Your Mother. What show are you partial to?
Which also makes an appearance. It makes its cameo in Glass Girls too. But yeah, Hannibal, fundamental. It was coming out when I was a teenager and just fundamental to shaping my sense of aesthetic. Cooking is one of my hobbies because of that show, and which is its own kind of twisted.
Yep. So Giselle does a location spell, right? Early on in the book. If you were to do a location spell, what would you want to create?
Ooh, oh, that's a good one. What would I, okay, if I were to do a location spec, it would be in the best cafe in Paris for writing. Because I am still trying to find like a go-to spot.
Okay. You'll have to let us know. Keep us updated. Or maybe not, because then you wouldn't want to be found. Never mind.
Exactly. It's secret. It's secret.
It's secret. Secret. I was going to say, what's you're Parisian, so we'll own that because you live there. What's the most unique thing about living in Paris?
Thing I think that strikes me the most is how the daily rhythm is so different. So I live in a very small studio. It's one room that I share with my partner. We have two burners. We don't have a stove. We have a mini fridge in place of a full fridge. And so that means that, we're doing grocery shopping every day, but it's, 10 minutes as opposed to a whole event.
Yes.
Groceries here are very seasonal. Produce here is very seasonal because there's big emphasis on growing things that are regional to France. So some days you'll go into the grocery store and you'll be like, oh, there's my, favorite type of cheese. And the next day you'll go in and it's gone. Season. That was quite weird for me when I went in. I was looking for celery last winter and I could not find celery. And that's such an American staple. I was like,
yes.
Where is the celery?
Every single stock soup that you start with. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So you learn to be a little bit more bendy about and a little more in tune with the seasons.
There you go.
Yeah.
What song would you always include on a road trip playlist?
One's hard because there's so many good. It's got to be an Avril Lavigne song. Happy Ending. Happy Ending by Avril Lavigne. It's a deep cut, but there's I go viscerally feral for that song.
That's awesome. And then the final thing I was going to ask you to pull a card because you're also a fan of tarot, but I thought what I would do so I don't put you on the spot is read what you had pulled for me, which really kind of changed the trajectory and the sense of urgency, I suppose, for why I started Storied Account podcast. The card you pulled was the Ace of Wands, which embodies the energy of the wand suit, which deals with passion projects. It represents new projects, optimism, and hope, and a charging forward into the unknown with a knowledge of success brewing in the future. So I just want to say thank you for pulling that card. Obviously, Conversations with Writers is a passion project, and that straightforward, that's there's Bronwyn right there. She's right alongside with me on this ride. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's been wonderful chatting with Danie Shokoohi, JB writer of Glass Girls. Make sure you go out and get it and then read everything she writes. Go back and look at her short stories and things she's published. She's incredible storyteller and an even better human being. So thank you all so much for listening to Storied Account with Jen Jumba.